book, A Few Good Women, and we have the co-writers or the author who for years was a university archivist who will be introduced in a moment by the person who President Nixon recruited in 1971 to come to the White House and help him undertake for the first time really in White House history, a focused, concentrated, aggressive effort to bring women into senior positions in government. It was perhaps at best a token effort before, but President Nixon, collaborating with Barbara, really wanted to see what could be done to bring people into the highest echelons of government. And before then, the glass ceiling had been pretty low. Barbara went to Penn State, and what impresses me, being a West Coast boy, is that she graduated from the Harvard Business School. And I've always thought anybody that did that should run the country. And I think, didn't Romney do that? And Bush, I think, well, somewhere. At any rate, Barbara is on our board, as she is a number of other boards. She has distinguished herself in government, later being Secretary of State, named by George Bush 41, and then her distinguished career in corporate America and in nonprofits like us. So it's my pleasure to introduce Barbara Hackman Franklin. Barbara.
Thank you, Sandy.
Right up there.
Okay. Thank you, Sandy, very much. Lee, why don't you come up here? I'll say a few things to start, but the author of this book is Lee Stout, and he is the esteemed emeritus archivist at Penn State University. Well, thank you, Sandy, very much, and thank you for that wonderful exhibit. We just love what you did with those photographs. Many of them are in the book. There are a lot of photographs in this book, actually. The book is a matter of simple justice, and we hope you go get one.
Not to put too fine a point on it. You know?
That was, yeah. I want to first say what an honor it was for me to serve in the White House of President Nixon and to be engaged in his effort, and I emphasize his effort because this would not have happened without presidential leadership. It just would not. The advancements would not have happened. To be involved in that effort as the recruiter of women and the point person who monitored the action plans that he required from his cabinet secretaries and agency heads. Great honor for me, and the results were really quite profound, and I believe at the time changed the conversation in the United States about equality for women. The women's movement was coming along quite noisily, a lot of bra burning and controversy and demonstrations and so on. And there were some real issues behind it, but it was a left-leaning movement. Well, I think the fact that a president of the United States, and in fact, a president that some thought was an unlikely president of the United States, to make a focus about women and advancing women in government and do it visibly and seriously, pulled equality from over here right into the mainstream of American life. Made it legitimate, made it okay. And as I said, I don't think without presidential leadership it would have happened, because there was not unanimity in this country about this. In fact, there were people who really didn't think this was such a good idea. There wasn't consensus that women could really have jobs and families and do it all at one time. Times have changed, but was not so then. One of the things that I believe came out of that changed conversation and changed environment was Title IX. And we are here just a few days after the 40th anniversary of the signing of Title IX, which of course precluded discrimination according to sex in any educational activity that was federally financed. And the biggest message in that, as we think now, was sports, but really that happened across the board. And it was just an amazing effect in American life. Well, let me stop there. I want Lee to tell you what he thought he was doing with this book. But first, a couple of words about where it started for me. And Lee and I bat this back and forth. We were sort of all there at the beginning. Margita White, whether any of you knew Margita White who were here, knew who I'm talking about, yeah, was in the Herb Klein communication shop when I was in the shop of presidential personnel. And we became close friends, and over the years, and I would put this probably in the late 80s or so, she said to me one day, and we used to see each other frequently, and she said, you know, that was really important. The advances for women were really important. We didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, they really were. And what could we do to bring this chapter alive? And there was another woman engaged in this conversation. Her name was Jean Rainey. And Margita's gone, unfortunately, but Jean is still with us. And Jean was a businesswoman, a pioneer in her own way. She knew a lot of the women who were there at that time, and she was involved in this. So this is the conversation. But I didn't know how to do anything to bring this alive. And then I became Secretary of Commerce. And then after that, my papers, I mean, Lee came to see me. Mm-hmm. My papers went to Penn State. And Lee was the archivist at the time, and I'm going to tell my side of this, and then you can tell your side, was cataloging my papers, and all this White House stuff was in boxes. It was a mess. It had been there for 20 years almost, or more. And Lee went through all this and then said to me, you know, this was really important. It wasn't just PR, it was important. Why don't you do something? How about an oral history project? That's where the idea for oral history came from. And we thought, I didn't know anything about oral history. I now know a lot more about it. Anyway, we started an oral history project called A Few Good Women, Advancing the Cause of Women in Government, 1969 to 74, in my DC office 16 years ago, on a wing and a prayer, with Lee's guidance and Penn State University Library Archives as our partner. And Jean Rainey, the woman I just mentioned, did most of the interviews, but then Lee took over toward the end. The collection now has nearly 50 of those histories, and Lee has used a lot of those stories of the women, which are fascinating. I mean, people don't know how things, we don't remember how things were as a part 2 of this book. I want to mention John Hamilton, whose mother is in this book. Pat Hitt is in this book, and she was a real dynamo, to say the least. She was, well, I think, if not the first, you thought it was the first appointment of women that that President Nixon made. She had been a longtime friend and family and worker for President Nixon, great Republican campaigner and everything else. And she was an assistant secretary at what is now HHS. And she was a terrific woman. I just wanted to single that out. And her story is in this book. And I'm going to stop right there and turn this over to Lee. And maybe you want to start with the question at the press conference that seemed to be a trigger. Mm-hmm. For this.
As Barbara indicated, this began as an oral history project. We didn't start out with the idea of writing a book. And we wanted to, as Barbara mentioned, in conversations with her and with reviewing her papers, which is an interesting story in and of itself, because most of her Nixon-era materials were in her storage locker in the basement of the Watergate. So I had the wonderful experience of taking Nixon White House materials out of the Watergate, which seemed ironic at the time, but appropriately.
Not stealing them.
I guess. But as we began to explore this and to examine this, one of the I think sort of the signal beginning was described as the question, and this came from a reporter who became a central figure in this project and in the history of leading up to Barbara's appointment and to her work in the White House. And this was Vera Glasser. So let me just read briefly. At his February 6, 1969 news conference, President Richard M. Nixon announced details of his upcoming European trip and then proceeded to take questions. Near the end of the news conference, which was dominated largely by foreign and defense issues, Vera Glasser of the North American Newspaper Alliance rose and asked, "Mr. President, in staffing your administration, you have so far made about 200 high-level cabinet and other policy position appointments, and of these, only 3 have gone to women. Can you tell us, sir, whether we can expect a more equitable recognition of women's abilities, or are we going to remain a lost sex?" The president, at only his second formal press conference, 17 days after the inauguration, and this is quoting a reporter, rolled his eyes upward for a moment in a kind of sighing chagrin. He then smiled at Vera Glasser and quipped, "Would you be interested in coming into the government?" There was some laughter, but apparently realizing that the issue and the television audience deserved more, he quickly added, very seriously, "I had not known that only 3 had gone to women, and I shall see that we correct that imbalance very promptly." Vera Glasser later recalled, "I had qualms as a journalist about asking the president that kind of question, and yet in simple justice, you had to ask it."
And Lee dug up a photograph is in the book of that press conference. It's all men. That's all you can see. And I can imagine what kind of a gasp went through that briefing room. She was very attractive, well-spoken, and she stood up and asked that. It was really a very courageous question. And the president responded, I think, just quite beautifully.
Yeah. And of course, that was obviously not the end of it. But at the same time, it took a while for this to be the beginning of something. And Barbara's appointment came in April of 1971. That's 2 years later. There were a period of months where there was continuing discussion and debate among the staff as to how to respond to this. I'm sure for some staff, for some of the men, it was whether to respond to it at all. And there were as many of the men have told us, even who worked with Barbara in the White House Personnel Office, we were sexist. We didn't think that women would want this or would or could do it. And then there were obviously some men who did. And there were probably an awful lot of men in the middle who it just simply hadn't occurred to them that women would want to do this. But once they discovered that this was the case, they didn't have a problem with that, and to one degree or another. And so things moved along not very quickly. Towards the end of 1969, as the preparations were coming for the State of the Union address in 1970, one of the staff members, a staff assistant to Arthur Burns, began to put together task forces on domestic issues that would give the president information about shaping a domestic agenda that would be addressed in that inaugural address.
Charlie Clapp. Some of you know Charlie Clapp.
And one of those task forces was women's rights and responsibilities. Charlie Clapp was one of the people we interviewed for the project, and he was very clear that he thought that this was an opportunity for the president and for the White House to take some ownership for some of these issues that heretofore had been judged as primarily a Democratic Party issue, that the Republican Party was not interested in these things. And he said, we have a lot of talented women. We have a real opportunity here. It's time that we address these issues.
And he won the internal White House battle, as he describes it, and some of this is in the book. I won't even mention the guy who was on the other side, some of you know. It was a question of what kind of people were going to be on this task force. And Charlie won the battle by having them be progressive people. Vera was on it, but there were some others, Virginia Allen, Pat Hutar, that some of you may have known. There was another force in the White House that wanted to put far more conservatively minded about women, anyway, on this task force. The bottom line of it was that the report was issued that was issued was a progressive set of document about, with recommendations that were far-reaching about what should be done. One of them was my job. One of them was more political appointments. One of them was what could be the forerunner, however you view it, of a Title IX. Had the other side won, had this not been a progressive document, I'm not sure that some of the action would have happened as readily. So this was important. The title of that report was A Matter of Simple Justice. And that's why Lee's got that title on this book. And another thing that was in those recommendations, I'm going to pick up now in April of '71, was the idea that the president should issue action plans, or ask for action plans from his cabinet secretaries and agency heads about how they were going to advance women in those departments, appoint, train, et cetera. And he had a deadline. I want these back by a date in May, and I want to know who's going to be in charge. So right there, you have a managerial kind of approach to this. And the second prong, there were 3 prongs here. That was the first one, the action plans. The second prong was my coming in there to be the recruiter of women. I was brought in there by Fred Malek, who headed presidential personnel and was very much in tune and on board with this whole initiative. And the third prong was to bring Jane Baker Spain, who was a businesswoman from Ohio, to the old Civil Service Commission, and she was to watch over women in the civil service. And it was the 3-pronged effort that moved forward. We had goals. We had numerical goals about how many women we were going to place in the senior levels in a year, advancing in the mid-levels, and in boards and commissions. These were not quotas. I've been asked that a lot. These were targets. And departments had targets. The action plans came to my office. They were not in very good shape. And some really persistent reporter kept banging on us that wanted these action plans. So I had a lot of work to do with the departments. Well, nobody had ever done this before, to shape them up. And again, there were targets and levels of targets in those plans. And then they were monitored. I mean, it was up to me, and then I would report up to Fred. Another person I want to mention that was sitting high up in the hierarchy of the White House was Bob Finch, who had a lot to do with this. We have copies of some of the memoranda that I think he stimulated that have had the president's initials, decision memoranda. Bob Finch was very much on track with this. Well, anyway, that was the package, the 3-pronged effort to advance women in the federal government, and we monitored, and that was the managerial part of this. And when a cabinet secretary did a good job, got a nice note from the president that got drafted down at my level and then sent up and then sent over, and another kind of note got sent when a secretary missed a target. And I think what made this work, I truly believe, is that, and there were a lot of people who helped too, and there were some people who didn't, as Lee was saying, didn't really think this was a good idea, and some of them helped anyway. Some of them just didn't. But you know, that's life, I guess. What was I going to say? I just lost my people helping. Yeah. Anyway, bottom line results, let me just fast forward. In a year, we had tripled the number of women in the higher level. Our goal was to double. We had tripled. And the most important thing about it, to me, was that more than half of them were in jobs that women had never held before. So once you break those barriers, then it's not so hard to have women in those jobs again. Helen Delich Bentley was their chairman of the Maritime Commission. That's a whole interesting story about how she got that job. Unusual for a woman. She's unusual. She, at 88 years old, is still as feisty as she was then. Marina Whitman was the first woman on the Chairman's Council of Economic Advisors. Cynthia Holcomb Hall, who was from this area, actually, was the first woman on the tax court, later went on to become a jurist of the Ninth Circuit. Dixie Lee Ray became the first woman chairman of the old Atomic Energy Commission. These are the kinds of jobs. And then in the middle level, there were 1,000 women moved up when the federal government was cutting itself back 5%. And that's where you had the first Secret Service agents, tugboat captains, forest rangers, those kinds of non-traditional jobs. That's when it happened. The first military, generals and admirals, that's when it happened too, in that whole time frame. And so once the genie was out of the bottle, it just kept going. And what I think I started to say before, it wouldn't have happened, I think, without the president saying, I want this to happen. And without the managerial underpinning. This was typical, if any of you are into this, management by objective sort of stuff. Monitoring, setting goals and monitoring them and saying good job when you did a good job and when you didn't.
Yeah. This was a time period, and this is, I'm sure you're all familiar with this, of great turmoil internationally. The entire first term is taken up with Vietnam. You have, during this time period, the India-China war. You had Yasser Arafat became head of the PLO almost within 2 or 3 weeks of President Nixon's inauguration, and so eventually the Yom Kippur War in Israel, tremendous international problems, the tensions with the Soviet Union that eventually were ameliorated through the development of the ABM treaties and the SALT agreements. At home, the same kind of turmoil over the protests against the war and all that went with that, gradually worsening economic conditions, and a very aggressive domestic agenda. This is a president who wanted to have efficient, effective government. And Barbara mentioned the management by objectives, the idea of a government staff and administration, and 90% of government workers were in the executive branch, that was going to be managed effectively, and that was a difference, a move from the old idea of cabinet government where you left it up to the cabinet secretaries to appoint all of the people that would be working for them in the senior executive service and political appointees, to a new kind of system where the appointees would come out of the president's office, out of the White House, but that the idea would be that, and this was the president's directive, that competence was the top priority. Political agreement with the philosophy of the president was important, but number one had to be competence. This was not, let's get a job for Senator Snarf's niece or something like that. It was that was what. Must have been the ghost of Senator Snarf. Let's try this again. But in any case, this was this was the kind of era that we were working with, and of course, given all that, the presidential leadership, as Barbara indicated, was critical. But the president wasn't working on this every day, but regularly he would come back to the staff and say, how is it going? Why aren't we accomplishing anything? Why aren't we moving ahead with this project? So it was his regular pushing on this that really made a staff that was probably representative of the divisions of society about the advancement of women. It was his push that said, yes, we need to do this, we're going to do this.
And that's what made it work. There were some interesting people in this, and when I would go and go find women, and I had a way to do that. I had the country divided into regions, and I would go to each one and try to find sources, people who could tell me where the women were. And so many were there were a lot of women out there underpaid, underrecognized, just it was the way things were. And not as many women as we would have liked, but I would go beating the bushes in effect and looking for them. And we were getting quite a lot of mail. But the personnel shop at that point had two sides. One was the recruiting side, and there were some men looking for men, or looking for whoever. And then there was a placement side, the liaison side. So whoever I found, in terms of women, I had to find out where the job openings were. And then I had to get and they were all men, on the liaison side to help place them. So there were several layers of pushing and pulling in there. And I credit Fred with being always very supportive. Some of the liaison guys, well, they really always were. But the story I always like to tell has to do with Stan Anderson, because Stan always delivered. But Stan could be kind of prickly, and we had this intercom, and I would call Stan on the intercom about, what are you doing with whatever, and he would hang up on me sometime. I've heard enough of this stuff, and he'd clunk. So then I would have to walk down to his office. He was on the first floor of the old EOB, and I was on the third, and have to say, gee, Stan, you didn't really mean to hang up on me, did you? But anyway, it was that kind of stuff that had to go on. And then finding where the openings were. And if I could, I would get a commitment up front that, gee, if I can find women for this job, give me a shot at it. And I would go to Fred and the liaison guys. And I didn't succeed every time, but I succeeded enough. But that's what it took. And then people, there were many others who joined in here and really wanted to help. I have to say that Ron Walker and his advance guys were down the hall from where my office was on the third floor of the EOB. And they had a great big room, and they had a refrigerator in there. And they had a few other accoutrements. So once in a while, if things got a little frenzied on my part of the floor, I would go hide out in his office, and I appreciated that very much. I often needed the respite. One other thing.
Scotch.
Yeah.
Is that what it was? I never knew what they were drinking. I should have known. They were the best advance team in the history of the universe.
They were a sanctuary.
Yes. Well, but your advance, you created the modern day advance. Presidential advance, you absolutely did. And the balloons. These guys created all those balloons. Okay. One other anecdote about my office had to do with the bust of Susan B. Anthony. Some women's groups. Now, I had to interact with women's groups because there wasn't anybody else there to do this. In fact, I crossed over to the other side of the Ehrlichman side of the house to get into issues, too, because there wasn't anybody else doing that. But anyway, Susan B., some women's groups wanted to give a bust of her to the White House. It was a great symbolic effort. And so we said, great, and they got a copy of the one in the crypt of the Capitol. And if you know what she looked like, she was a pretty serious, severe-looking person. And when she came to us in bronze, she was really severe-looking. She resided in the closet in my office in the old EOB between the time she arrived and we could arrange a presentation to the White House to Mrs. Nixon. Well, in the dead of night, on occasion, she would steal out of my closet, and she would land in the office of someone in the White House who'd said or done something detrimental to women. So it was known that the spirit and bust of Susan B. Anthony roamed the White House on occasion at night. And then after she was presented, which I believe was early in 1973, she stood for years at the entrance of the East Wing, which is First Lady's wing, on a pedestal. And she's now not there, and I'm told she was put in the basement of the White House, and that we may be able to find her again. I mean, the Clem Conger, who was the White House curator, was very annoyed with the whole thing. He would say to me, "This is not art." I'd say, "It's not meant to be art. It's meant to be a symbol." So anyway, that's the bust of Susan B. Do you think we should stop and see if there are questions from the audience?
Just one more. I think that of the women that we were able to interview, and we felt it was important to get going on this because we felt we were in danger of losing a lot of these women if we didn't start the project in the 1990s. And the stories that we heard were really amazing. And initially, the book was going to be primarily about the stories that these women told. I thought that, well, in doing this book, the focus will be those stories, and we'll have a little bit of historical introduction to provide some context. And the more research I did, the more the story of how this all came about became almost equally interesting. And so we have a book that's sort of the half the history of this evolution of this women's program, and the other half is the story. And one of my favorite ones, and for some of you it may be a reminder of what it was like, but this is the first section of the women's stories is called Overcoming Barriers, and this is the story that Marina Whitman, who was the first woman to serve on the Council of Economic Advisors, told. And she said, looking back, there were all kinds of constraints which are absolutely intolerable, but which somehow we really didn't notice, or if we noticed, we didn't take them terribly seriously. That seems incredible now, but I guess we hadn't really been sensitized, and there were so many things that we could do and did do that it didn't bother us that way. Certainly later, it seemed appalling. I remembered when I was graduating, one of the best employers was IBM, which hired young liberal arts graduates for what they called computer engineers. They were really salespeople with a little bit of training. It was a great job, and the interview was going splendidly. I was first in my class and had what was by then a very famous name in computing circles, von Neumann. She was John von Neumann's daughter, who worked with Albert Einstein at the Institute for Advanced Study. Said everything was going just great until he looked at my left hand and said, "Oh, I see you're engaged." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I'm sorry. We have a policy. We don't hire engaged girls." And she told us the story in the context of telling her daughter and her best friend when they had just finished college, and they said, "Then what did you say, Mom?" Waiting for some wonderfully snappy answer. And I said, "Well, I don't know how to tell you this, but I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and apologized for taking their time and left." And of course, their faces fell right to their knees. And I said, "You don't understand. At that time, I could have laid on the floor and kicked my legs and screamed, and it wouldn't have made any difference. There was no EEOC. There were no rules. He had a perfect right to say it, and there wasn't much I could do about it." That's changed.
But that's a profound example. A bunch of other things like that. We would hope that this book would help young women, young men too, to understand what this was like, or what the world was like and how it's changed. It's not perfect yet. I'll be the first one to say, but there's been just a great advance made. Something else I should have said earlier, and that was that when we were starting the oral history project, I did come here to the library to see what we could do to link up. We've now linked up, we're all electronically, but there was no capacity at that point that the library had that would have enabled us to do a joint thing. Today might be a different matter, but back then it wasn't. But I do remember seeing the president's yellow pads and handwritten notes that I was shown by the archivist. Anyway, yeah.
So questions?
I have.
Ed.
I have a comment first, just reflecting on your introduction. Shall I use this thing? Mine. You can still hear me? First of all, the president's, personnel office, I can visualize it back in the days when men were looking for men. Well, that would be suspect in the first place. Why would they be doing that? And then women searching for women, that's also suspect. So the question I have is, the White House Personnel Office, from the Nixon White House on inward to the following commands, did it reflect an improvement all the way along? Did they keep the open door toward women more and more? Or was that just a flash and then it had to develop slowly?
No, I think they did. Once the three-pronged effort got going, once you open Pandora's box, it's kind of hard to shut it back down. So yeah, it kept going, and even after the Nixon administration, it kept going and forward, and the whole whole effort really has kept going. And I think it was time, but I really think the president just accelerated what some people said would have happened anyway. Well, maybe so, but it wouldn't have happened at that time unless the president.
At least he picked up on the realization with that question from Vera Glazer.
Yeah,
and made something of it.
He picked it right up, and he then followed, as Lee just said. He did follow once all this got going. He followed the results, and that's really important. There's a real fundamental message here. The leader at the top can make such a huge difference.
Only other summary on this is Pat hit and who was a famous lady we got at the Maritime Commission.
Helen Bentley.
Yep.
Yep.
I mean, characters like that were bound to do something in an executive position.
Yeah.
Because if she weren't appointed, at least she'd have an awful lot to say. And they did make an impact, all of them.
Well, that was Lee mentioned the competence that was part of the litany then. They were not just looking for people to shove into jobs. They had to be qualified. They had to be competent. That was true of the women, too. And in fact, they were probably overqualified because nobody wanted to take a risk with a woman. But I don't think any of the women failed that were appointed. I really don't. And I think that's also a testimony.
And when you look at some of the women who got their start, I mean, there were no secretaries of agencies appointed in the Nixon administration, as there had been Ovida Kalpovi in the Eisenhower administration. You go back to Frances Perkins, but
that was it.
But the women who got their start, I mean, you have 4 future cabinet secretaries, including Barbara, but Elizabeth Dole, Carla Hills, and Anne McLaughlin, all were appointed to positions, assistant secretary positions, or other positions from which they would go on, gain more management experience, and eventually become cabinet secretaries, judges, lead councils and agencies, chairman of commissions. All were getting their feet wet, if you will, in these programs. And you could look at the same thing in the career service, in the civil service, where, I mean, we did a presentation at a bookstore in Washington, and we had 2 women stand up that we had never seen before, who said, you know, I remember this. I was starting out as a young woman in the agency in which they were beginning, and because of this program, I was able to get into a management internship program. I was mentored. I was given the opportunity to work around in different parts of the agency. And if it hadn't been for this, I'd probably still be a GS5, and I got to be a GS11, thanks to these programs that opened up these opportunities. And that's what the president was all about. We want to give women the opportunities to do what they want to do. And if this is what they want to do, we're going to make that possible.
Well,
Set them up on the launch pad and watch them fly.
That's right.
And watch them fly. Well, and I think the reason that there was a ripple effect through our society was that this was a visible effort, and it had presidential imprimatur on it. And then others and actually in one of his pronouncements, he challenged state and local governments to do the same thing. And then it just caused this mindset change, and then opportunities opened in a lot of other places. And it's never stopped. As we said, it's not perfect now, but it's never stopped. And that's really where the floodgates were opened, right then. John?
Where do we stand right now against the rest of the world? I don't mean Iran or Iraq.
On the women?
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, you know, you see women in very prominent positions, Germany, England, Canada. Are we ahead, behind, keeping up? Or?
Not sure where we are. If you look at it that way, we're still the biggest. The biggest. The rest of the world is now, or I should say this a different way. Mandates seem to be prevalent in the rest of the world. Legislative, executive mandates. I mean, I was just in France last week. They've got a mandate, and I've forgotten the numbers, but you have to have X number of women or percentages on corporate boards by such and such a date. And some of it is a governmental challenge of the same kind. I used it last week with this group, which was an international group that I was with, gave them the book, and said, you know, I know you're wrestling with these kinds of mandates, but here was another way to do something that didn't require a legislative mandate. I still think we don't have enough women in elective positions here. I mean, just look at the numbers. We are behind, and there's still resistance. There's still what I call silent resistance. Sometimes it's not silent, but now you can get sued if you're too talkative about your not wanting women. There's silent resistance. There's still some sort of unconscious resistance to women in leadership roles. I still think. And there's still the concern, this comes out of Title IX, some people saying, gee, there are more women now, a majority of women getting all kinds of degrees in this country. I mean, it's upwards of 50-some%, but not in certain disciplines, like science. It's the STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. We need more of that. So I don't know where we are in the overall scheme of things. I still would, in my lifetime, I'd like to see a woman elected president of the United States. I would like that.
Is it true, Ms. Franklin, that you're being considered by Beth Myers for the vice presidential, along with Chrissy and Rubio? Any other questions? Anybody? Bob?
Did Mrs. Nixon have an influence on the president's thinking with respect to the women's issues?
Great point. Should have mentioned that, because I think that's in the, I don't know if it's in the exhibit, but I know we've talked about that, Bob. Yes, I think she did. People were fond of asking, they still ask, well, why did President Nixon do this? Well, I don't know. I'm just glad that he did. But if you look at him and you look at his mother, who was important to him, he had a strong, self-made wife in Mrs. Nixon. He had 2 daughters. That's a pretty good start right there. So, I mean, I really think there was this is the right thing to do, is where he was. Plus, there was a political instinct at work. And yes, Mrs. Nixon, when it came to the Supreme Court, we do have documentation of that. That's in the book, in Julie Eisenhower's oral history, that she was not happy with her husband when he did not appoint a woman to the Supreme Court in 1971. There were 2 vacancies, and according to Julie, she made that clear.
And I think there was a woman judge who was on the short list, but the American Bar Association shot her down as incompetent to serve. And of course, Sandra Day O'Connor was in your talent bank.
Yeah. Took another 10 years, but yeah. Well, the woman who was shot down was from here. Her name was Mildred Lilly. Is that ringing? And she probably wasn't of the right stature, but I think it was the first time a woman was really in the mix. We beat the Bushes trying to find women back then, and they weren't there. They weren't there were too few in terms of numbers, but they weren't philosophically compatible with the president. No, I believe, frankly, that Mrs. Nixon did have a role in all of this, that we don't really, Ed's nodding, that we don't really know what she was saying to her husband when nobody else was around, but I think she was really a force behind the scenes in this.
One other thing here. There are cultures around the world, outside the United States, not all of them, but so many, where obviously women are just precluded altogether. Half the brain power of that culture is lost as long as they ignore the women. So that's another religious culture, of course, that does that. But someday, that wake-up call will come about. I'll be gone, but these kids today, maybe we'll see it come. And thank God we have archives and directors of archives putting this kind of thing together. It's good stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lee's done a really classy job, and all the photographs that are in the in the book that came either out of the oral history or that Lee just dug out of somewhere, because you did research here.
Yes, I did research here, and some of the photographs are from the collections here. And I just want to, as an archivist, I have to put a plug in. You have some really wonderful staff archivists working here who are extraordinarily helpful to scholars, and I think you can be very proud of the service that they provide to researchers, and I just want to make sure that they know that. Yeah.
So folks, they're here today to not only talk about what happened in the Nixon administration in the recruitment of women, but to sign the book. Lee, hold it up, please. Which coincidentally, and purely coincidentally, is now available in our gift shop, where you can leave, go down the hall, purchase it in the gift shop, and they will be in the lobby signing copies, personal copies. They make great Christmas gifts, they make great Mother's Day gifts, they make great gifts, and for your own library or home collection. Now, they didn't really come here for that. All our speakers come here really for one thing, and that's the lavish gifts that we give them. That's embarrassing. We used to give big honorariums, and they would turn it down and say, no, we want a memento, we want a gift. So it's my pleasure, through my surrogate, Jimmy the intern, to present you with these one-of-a-kind, limited edition, limited, of course, to the number we can sell. What would Nixon do mugs? Those two, purely coincidentally, we made a few extras. They're all numbered with the price on the bottom in the gift shop. So please join us in the gift shop, get your book, and then have them autograph it. Thank you both for coming. They're always welcome back.